You're listening to Salford City Radio 94.4 FM with your host, Jimmy Petruzzi, on the Friday Sports Show, bringing you all the news from the local area and around the world. And we're very fortunate on this show to bring you some of the world's best sports people, athletes from around the world, who give us some interesting insights into their role in sport, athletes, sports people who work in sport as well, across a broad range of areas, such as coaches, trainers. But we've also started a new segment speaking to people who work in the field of psychology and related disciplines, and we're very fortunate to have some of the world's leading figures in the area to speak about what they do and some of their research and their views on the field of their area of specialism. Today we have a really fascinating guest. It's a big area, really. A really interesting area we're going to talk about today. I think that you're going to be really fascinated. I certainly am looking forward to speaking to today's guest and talking more about what has been defined as imposter syndrome. And it's really interesting because it's certainly my experience of working with people across a broad range of areas, I find it quite fascinating, and I've come across the term on a number of occasions. But we're going to get someone who's going to give us a really interesting insight into her thoughts in the area, and it's Dr. Laura Kilby, reader in social psychology at Sheffield Hallam University. Dr. Laura Kilby, welcome to the show. Great to have you on board.
Hi there, nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, really interesting concept, imposter syndrome. I mean, how would you define it, Laura? What are your thoughts on imposter syndrome? What would you say it is?
So I guess fundamentally people experience it as a kind of a really deep-rooted sense of fraudulence in their professional life. And the kind of research around imposter syndrome teases out, I guess, three main features. The first one is that people who experience it, they tend to have quite a firmly held belief that other people, the people around them, have got an overinflated perception of their abilities. So they think, they're concerned that the people around them think they're much better than they actually believe themselves to be in their job.
Yeah.
Coupled with that, there is a sort of, it goes hand in hand with a fear then that the true abilities are going to be found out. So there is this sense of kind of constant anticipation and worry and fear that somebody's going to kind of realise that this kind of fraudulent person. And then the last thing is that they tend to have a kind of a constant sort of persistent tendency to attribute their successes to external factors. So when they do well, they put that down to it being luck or just good fortune rather than a result of their own ability.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And, certainly on my journey, Laura, I've spoken to people who've almost like labelled themselves as well without sort of probably knowing too much about it. It's kind of a label out there. And I suppose you think in one sense, do you think that there's sort of a danger in sometimes people sort of labelling themselves as having imposter syndrome without sort of, knowing the full implications like you've mentioned there? It's quite interesting your take on it. Do you sort of see a potential sort of, danger in labelling ourselves?
I think that's a really interesting point, and I think increasingly we see the language of imposter syndrome being discussed and talked about, and in many respects that's a good thing because it means people are feeling confident to sort of open up about their fears or their worries. But there's a kind of an interesting balance to be struck, I think, between what might be a reasonable level of kind of self-doubt or a kind of the opposite of being overly confident, just having a measured sense of your ability and perhaps sometimes being a bit doubtful. Yeah. And then, how that slips over for some people into actually being a really maladaptive feature of their sense of who they are and what they're capable of.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think as well as that, I mean, on the other side of things, there's sort of the confidence type thing where I suppose in one sense where if we're sort of competent in an area and we sort of lack the confidence, then that can be an issue. But we don't have the competence, then you could make an argument. Say, for example, I wouldn't be confident, doing surgery, and rightly so, because I'm not a medical person. That's not a bad thing in one sense. But on the other side of things, there are a lot of people out there that are certainly capable of doing what they would like to do. They sort of may lack the confidence. Does that sort of tie into imposter syndrome? Laura, is that sort of does that sort of tie into people sort of feeling the imposter syndrome? And what do psychologists think drive imposter syndrome?
So the kind of very early work on this, it was originally work that developed in the 1970s. US academics Pauline Clance and Susan Eames were starting to notice that many of the successful women around them in their own professional circles seemed to doubt the roots of their own success.
Yeah.
So that led to some research, and there was quite a large study with about 150 women who were objectively very successful. So these are people who are doing well in their careers, according to all of the sort of external objective measures, are successful. But what they found was that, you know, throughout those interviews, that many of their participants really struggled to legitimise their own success, regardless of how much sort of objective information might tell them that they were doing well.
Yeah.
And they very much sort of attribute their successes to external factors, so luck, or thinking that it was as a result of having colleagues who were supportive and so forth. And then this kind of persistent fear of being viewed by others as unworthy or being found out. So I think, you know, where we see people who seem to experience this imposter phenomenon, it's where they are objectively, you know, are doing really well. So it's, you know, you're quite right in saying there's lots of things out there that it's a really good thing we recognise we can't do and we don't try to do. But where we're sort of successful in our own careers, that's where we tend to see that for some people, there's a disconnect between what's objectively going on and how they're experiencing it. And that can be in all range of careers, you know, from, I guess, people in sort of sporting and, you know, high performance environments like that. But across a whole range of sectors. And whilst that early work was very much, the sort of thinking was that this was something that was very much experienced by women primarily, you know, the work that's gone on over the course of the past 40 years is sort of flagging up that actually this is something that can be experienced by men and women.
Yes, absolutely. Interesting you say. I mean, years ago, I remember working with someone. I was doing some sort of coaching, and I'm not going to sort of name the organisation for confidentiality, but he worked very high up in this organisation at sort of director level, and it was quite interesting because I was working with him, and he said himself, Laura, he felt he had imposter syndrome. He had a promotion, so he moved from one sort of role to another, and he went as high as you could be from a, you know, senior authority in the organisation, and from the outside in, no one would probably ever guessed it, the way he sort of carried himself and the way he would communicate. And I was quite fascinated. Fascinated is maybe the wrong word. I was quite intrigued how someone, you know, who's so highly regarded by everyone, and from the outside looking in, didn't sort of show any signs. When we sort of talked about things in a more deeper level, said that he felt that he wasn't worthy of the role, and I was really intrigued. And what's your take on, you know, why do some people feel it more than others? I mean, why do some people actually feel more of like an imposter than other people?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think, so there's two things you said there. One is that, you know, that recognition that you had that somebody who, you know, for all their external appearances was incredibly successful, was experiencing these feelings of imposterism. And one of the issues is it is something which I think people really struggle to speak openly about, because they're concerned that if they put name to those feelings, it sort of confirms that they are an imposter. So there is an issue there about people being able to sort of share that they have those feelings. I think in terms of, you know, what causes it, I mean, that's always a $1 million question, isn't it? There is research that has sort of tried to make sense of the causes. I guess the most direct cause, so the kind of direct link is that it's caused by an inability to be able to kind of accurately self-assess our performance. But I suppose the more interesting question is, well, why is that? You know, why can't we make those accurate self-assessments? Some studies have found that there are links to kind of family background. So, for example, one study found that it was more prevalent amongst people who were first generation to exceed the norms of their family. So, you know, where somebody's the first person, perhaps first generation of their family at university, or first person to have substantial success in a particular field or career, that seems to be, there's more prevalence there. There is research that also has linked it to parental styles. So there's some really interesting research that's found, for example, correlations between people who experience this sense of imposterism and experiences of heightened parental control during childhood. There was a really interesting study back in 2010 that explored this relationship between parenting styles and imposter syndrome. And those authors argued that this phenomenon of imposterism in part linked to what they talked about as significant long-term effect of childhood parentification. And what they mean by parentification is where we have a child who is taking on adult responsibilities at long time before they're kind of developmentally ready for adult responsibilities. And what they were arguing was that as children grew up, they were sort of experiencing or having to live the life of an adult while still a child, so there was a kind of a sense of fraudulence in their childhood, and that they argue that that carried over into adult life, so they kind of internalised this sense of identity, this schema about who they are as a person, as being somebody who's inauthentic, and that can then feed into their professional life. So there's there's some ideas about parenting, but there's probably a lot of complex factors. There's other research that suggests that personality type can play a part. As you might imagine, people who show higher levels of conscientiousness in their personality tend to also show higher levels of imposterism. And there's some interesting recent work that looks at the prevalence of imposter syndrome amongst people from underrepresented racial, ethnic and religious minority groups. And again, there's indication there that where people are from a minority group that are potentially less represented in a particular work environment, there is again a greater likelihood of experiencing imposterism.
That's really interesting. I mean, I'm sort of guessing that, from what you say there, things are sort of multifactorial. It's a sort of combination of factors, and I suppose it's sort of the perfect storm in one sense, where it's a combination of factors that take someone to where they are. In one sense, what sort of intrigues me is that, okay, I mean, it can work to a point. I think having being conscientious is a positive thing in many ways. It can work to a point. But then equally in saying that, if it sort of crosses a sort of fine line where, at what point does it become an issue for people, or to have this imposter syndrome? Where do you sort of draw the line between, okay, having some doubt may be a good thing, but then having too much doubt can be debilitating? At what point does it become maladaptive for people? What are some of the, have you sort of come across anything to sort of suggest that this can be maladaptive for people?
Yeah, so I think, the tricky question is at what point, because I guess it's, one of the challenges I was saying is that it's something that people find quite hard to talk about openly, because in talking about it, it kind of confirms, their concern is it confirms that they are a fraud.
Yes.
So people struggle to talk about it. What we do know is that, the upshot of somebody experiencing it is that it can be, as you can imagine, absolutely exhausting.
Yes.
And what can happen is obviously there's a number of things. So it can leave work being absolutely devoid of any pleasure. It's been linked to, long-term stress and anxiety amongst people who experience it, and also a higher risk of burnout. And I think the reason for that is because it often leads people, so there is research that shows what happens is it leads people to engage in maladaptive behaviours that are kind of linked to perfectionism.
Yes.
So people tend to over-prepare, they overthink, and they also overestimate the significance of mistakes. Now, in the workplace, mistakes happen, we have problems, things don't always go to plan. When those things happen to somebody who's experiencing a really strong sense of imposterism, that leads them into a really negative cycle. And what tends to happen is that the feelings of being an imposter kind of ironically create a cycle whereby we work even harder to try and compensate for those feelings. So we become even more conscientious. We try and mask what we perceive as our kind of fraudulent success. And of course what happens is that hard work, that extra work that we're doing, often leads on to more professional success, because objectively we're being recognised for working and achieving. So we might get promoted or recognised for our achievements in other ways, and the more success we have, the greater the fraudulence feels. So people get trapped in this negative sort of maladaptive cycle where they feel fraudulent, so they work extra hard, so they get promoted, so they feel even more fraudulent.
And in
so it's a real problem.
And absolutely, and in one sense, it's like they become that sort of chronic striver where it's never really enough. In one sense, too, where you could imagine that. And it's interesting you mentioned there perfectionism, and I think with perfectionism as well, sometimes it can spill into other areas of one's life too, as well. So, for example, if let's say someone's got like a certain job that requires a level of perfectionism, if they're sort of, maybe an engineer or something like that, on a plane, you'd want them to be a perfectionist to a point. But equally, it can spill into their sort of personal life too, where they kind of potter about the house and does that happen with imposter syndrome too? Is it linked to just profession, or is it also from a personal point of view? People sort of maybe feel inadequate in other areas of their life too, Laura?
I think in terms of professions, in part it might be where it's been researched as opposed to where it's actually experienced, but certainly it's been documented in healthcare settings, it's been documented amongst people who work in finance, in accountancy, people working in law, in marketing, and there's been probably the most amount of research has actually studied it in educational settings, and that's both amongst academics but also amongst students. And there's quite a lot of research now that has identified that students, can really fall victim to these feelings of imposterism. Now, whether or not how that plays out into people's other sides of their life outside of their profession, I don't actually know, but I guess some aspects of the kind of personality features that have been linked to people who experience imposterism might suggest that you might see some of that playing out in other parts of people's lives. Yeah,
that's really interesting that you say. I think it's really fascinating, and certainly in sports, certainly in my experience of working with people in sport as well, it's quite surprising sometimes where certain people talk about what you've mentioned there. They talk about how they don't feel, they feel like a fraud. They don't feel that they don't feel the same way about themselves that they that other people do in one sense, like fans and coaches and so on and so forth. And it's quite interesting, really, because a lot of high achievers, Laura, who've got imposter syndrome too. And is that from the research you've done and your experience? Do you find that like the high achievers do? I mean, you mentioned there that people who do excel and do strive have that. Do you sort of find high achievers have this experience as well?
It tends to be sort of linked to this maladaptive cycle. So yes, unfortunately, what tends to happen is that people who are experiencing it are working even harder to try and prove their worth and to not, to sort of rid themselves of feeling fraudulent.
Yes.
And so they become increasingly recognised as high achieving in their particular profession. And I think the other thing is, we tend to see it, well, certainly the research that I'm aware of that's been done, we tend to see it in environments that are highly competitive and where success is at least in part linked to kind of peer judgment. And you mentioned there, high achieving sports people where the kind of, the fans, but also the experts around them really are kind of validating their success and their ability. This issue of peer judgment, I think, is part of it, because what we're relying on there as for our individual sense of how we're doing is somebody else telling us we're doing okay, as opposed to sort of an objective measure of how successful we are or we aren't. And again, we see that in higher education. So if we think about students, and as I mentioned, there's been research increasingly showing that students experience it. In most academic disciplines, success in education is based on the judgment of tutors, the judgment of our expert peers, as opposed to some objective measure, or even as opposed to, say, students being able to compare their work to work of their peers. And in the same way, amongst kind of academic success, there's a very intense competitive pressure to publish. And a successful publishing career relies on competing and succeeding through a process of peer review. And ultimately, that peer review is, the expertise and judgment of our scientific peers deciding, what gets published. So I think that, that reliance that in so many professions, we take our cues for how we're doing from subjective measures.
That's really
what's
interesting.
Available to us.
No, that's really interesting stuff, and certainly I can sort of relate to that in the sense that as a teacher myself, or lecturer myself, the students as well. And it's quite interesting you say is that, I mean, for example, if we do things like a role play or an assignment, and or maybe request work from the students, some of them, irrespective of how well they do, they don't seem to buy into their ability to sort of be able to graduate and sort of go on to a career. Sometimes there seems to be a belief issue around that. And I find fascinating. And have you read that study, Laura? I think it was sort of came to mind. Is it Dunning-Kruger effect? I can't recall now, but it was a study or some research around sometimes people who are very good at what they do undermine themselves, and people who aren't necessarily that great, sort of, just go out there and do it. I mean, is there a case for that for some people who maybe don't have as much ability but just sort of go for it, and some people who do have a lot of ability tend to sort of play themselves down? Do you think?
I guess it's always a balance, isn't it? Of, you can have fantastic natural ability in somebody in any kind of profession, but then to really achieve, it's that combination of ability and an awful lot of hard work. And you sort of need those things to come together. And for some people, they perhaps start off with perhaps what's viewed as slightly more natural ability, and but at some point that hard work has to kick in. Yes. And for other people, they might see themselves as having to work incredibly hard to every aspect of their kind of career. I think you mentioned there about that kind of self-sabotaging. There is some research which suggests that what we can see amongst people who experience imposterism is that there is a constant downplaying of their own accomplishments, and in doing that, people can potentially start to sabotage their own career. So they literally are talking themselves out of it. So again, that's something that can be a real challenge for people who are trying to, because for some people So I wrote about this issue of imposter syndrome at the start of the year, and it was published in the Psychologist, which is the flagship magazine of the British Psychological Society. So it's shared amongst members, and I was absolutely astonished at the response I received. So a huge number of kind of comments and tweets and feedback on social media of people just wanting to sort of say thank you for putting voice to the experiences, and also wanting to share their own experience. And I still get emails from people who come across the article, but what was really striking was the range of people who got in touch. So, I had emails from really seasoned academics, from PhD students, from professional psychologists working in counselling and clinical roles, people who were retired, who said, I experienced this all through my professional career. So the range of people that can experience this, there is a kind of a whole mix of people who have got clear ability, that there is no doubt of their professional success or their ability to achieve in their roles, and they can be aware of imposter syndrome as a kind of something that's out there that they've heard about, that they can talk about as in a kind of an intellectual way, but they will still really struggle then to be able to say, well, if that's what I'm experiencing, that helps me change how I feel. It's like the feelings are still there, even though they're aware of it.
But I suppose having that self-awareness can be a sort of step in that sort of direction, where I suppose in one sense it can almost be denial. Sometimes we can be in denial that we do have, if someone does has imposter syndrome, there might be some sort of denial that it's not there. It might be something else. They might be looking to sort of justify and compare themselves and think, well, actually, you know what, I'm not that level yet. Do you think by being self-aware, it is a step in the right direction to be able to sort of move forward and beyond that sort of syndrome, to sort of move away from it and, be a bit more relaxed about where we are and be a bit more focused and enjoy the journey too as well? And I mean, you mentioned the academia and sports as well, and I think sometimes it sort of takes away the pleasure of enjoying our learning as well, Laura, just going with the flow and enjoying it too.
I think that's the biggest problem with it, actually, is that it sucks the pleasure out of somebody's professional life. And actually, if you're somebody who is in an environment that you are sort of succeeding in, then there should be some pleasure attached to that success. You'd hope that there was some enjoyment attached to being able to have the privilege to work in an area that you probably enjoy, that you are achieving in, that you are, fully embedded it, that should come with a level of professional satisfaction. And I think that's that's the real downside. But I think getting back to your point about is self-awareness, a step in the right direction, it absolutely is. And there are things that can be done and that people can do to help them get beyond those feelings of imposterism. And some of them are really practical things. So, research would suggest that some of the things that we can do are, for example, devise ways to measure our achievements. So, create almost like a set of criteria or some sort of metrics that we can use to help us better self-assess our achievements. And obviously, they're really dependent on the job you do as to what they could be. But something that is meaningful for you in your own job that you can sort of perhaps look at each month or each week or whenever works and say, okay, how am I doing? And let me measure what I'm doing against these criteria that I know would make sense for if I'm achieving those things, then I'm doing okay. I think one of the other things is about talking to other people, so that kind of seeking validation from our peers. So everybody needs feedback, in all areas of professional and life. We all need some feedback on how is it we're doing. And in most roles now, we have performance appraisals and we sit down once a year or maybe twice a year and we have some sort of professional appraisal. But actually, we perhaps don't need to wait for them in order to seek out some feedback on how we're doing. So, for example, in my role as a kind of a dual role of researching and teaching, we might often use teaching observations. So we'll have a peer come in and observe our teaching. And that's really important and meaningful both for improving our teaching practice, but also as useful feedback on, how is that like? What is our teaching like? Is it at a level that is good for students? So, ways in which we can seek validation from other people, I think, are really important. And then probably also, taking time to reflect and reappraise what we are expecting of ourselves, to think about our goals. Are they realistic? How are we dealing with failures? All of that helps us kind of take a meaningful reevaluation of the fact that actually we're probably doing okay.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. I think that's really some practical ideas for people for sure. And one thing's for sure as well, what I find really interesting as well is, I think you mentioned that in the 70s this sort of became apparent, but I suppose now the world is sort of changed in many ways. I mean, technology has been a big thing around that. I mean, in the 70s we didn't have the likes of social media that we have now as well. And do you think that technology has played a big impact in this too, in terms of how we sort of feel in terms of getting validation as well? It's sort of magnified it where we are today. Maybe modern technology, social media has played its role too in people maybe magnifying imposter syndrome.
I think social media is really interesting in terms of, I think what it perhaps does flag up to us is that we do need validation. So, you sort of really, in so many ways, not, aside from imposter syndrome, in so many ways we see the good and the bad of something like social media, where people are monitoring how many likes they get for a post and how crippling it can be to somebody if actually nobody's liking their post or, they're not receiving retweets or there's a negative comment. So it's a kind of a double-edged sword, isn't it, social media? I think it's brought us so many advances. It allows us to connect, it allows us to support one another, it allows us to validate what people are doing around us, but it also leaves us very open to negativity or a lack of validation. So I guess the way that technology and social media is kind of interlinked with people's professional lives means that there's less, I think for a lot of people, there's less space to step down from your working day and your working life. So that, if you are experiencing feelings of imposterism around your professional life and you're also on social media in the evenings and so on and so forth, then those things can become increasingly, start to take over parts of your life where you might have stepped away and had some space to reflect.
Yes, no, that's really interesting stuff, and some of the practical ideas you gave there were really interesting too, Laura. And one of the reasons being is that you mentioned there the sort of the article that you wrote, and it was a really interesting one as well. And I sort of do a bit of part-time editorial work on a North Bulletin, and I'm sometimes sort of surprised that sort of people are apprehensive about contributing, even though their writing style is fantastic. They've got, really interesting ideas as well. But I can I can't put it down to imposter syndrome. I don't know too much about the area to say that, but I feel that the feedback I get sometimes from people when I suggest if they'd like to sort of contribute or assess to contribute is kind of the apprehension, really. I know it's hard to give advice. I'm not asking to give any advice, but what are some tips maybe for someone who's aspiring to do an article that sort of, put their thoughts out there for the world to see? Laura, what can they do in terms of not letting this get in their way or getting out of their own way if they want to do that? I mean, you have some sort of good practical ideas there, but what could you sort of say to someone who's sort of really apprehensive and thinks, what, I'm not sort of worthy of contributing? Yeah.
I mean, I guess I can only speak from my own experience, and that is that you just have to do it.
Yeah.
If it's, and I think you have to value your voice. And in valuing your voice, actually you're valuing other people's voices.
Yeah.
And what I found so I guess in my job, I write academic research papers, based on research that I've done, and they're very impersonal. I don't really, as an author, I don't really exist in those. So they're a sort of separate part of my identity. When it came to writing about imposter syndrome and writing in the BPS magazine, I was asked to kind of write myself into that, and I found it incredibly uncomfortable to do.
Yes.
In the same way that coming on the radio is a new challenge. So what I wrote in this article, and I think I still experience this, is when I'm doing something new that puts me out of my comfort zone and something that makes me visible in my writing. That can raise these feelings of, what am I right to do that, and who am I to say that, and who would want to listen to that? What I really reflected on after writing it was when I got so many responses from people, the thing that really struck me was the paralysis that people feel about exactly this, about being able to speak openly about things that actually they've got something to say on. And, I think that in all kind of venues, whether it's on social media, whether it's in writing for publication, whether it's writing a blog, whether it's doing something that is you're publishing yourself, if you've got something to say and you've got a voice to use, then you've sort of just got to do it and trust the process. And so what if nobody reads it? You've still said it, you've still had that outlet. And if just one person reads it and what you've done enables them or interests them or makes a difference or makes them laugh or smile or whatever, then actually it was meaningful that you did that.
Absolutely. That's a great.
I think you've just got to do it.
Great. That's a great point. I think that's a fantastic point. And I think that people listening to the show and hearing you speak, Laura, I think it goes a long way to reassuring and at least normalising it for some people that it's okay to sort of feel that way. It's sometimes we can sort of question ourselves, but what we can do is become more aware of it and sort of maybe extend the comfort zone rather than sort of dive in and sort of just extend it gradually to the point that we can sort of go towards where we want to go. I certainly found the article and sort of speaking to you, really interesting. I'm sure our listeners did too. Laura, I really want to thank you for coming aboard the show. It's been fantastic speaking to you. Really interesting stuff. It was Dr. Laura Kilby who gave us an insight into imposter syndrome. I think all of us experience imposter syndrome to a certain level on some sort of spectrum at some point in our life in certain contexts. And what a fascinating insight into it by Laura. Listening to 94.4 FM Salford City Radio, the Friday Sports Show. Your host, Jimmy Petruzzi. And now, next guest we're going to be speaking to is going to focus on cricket. So stay tuned and make sure you keep your dial on 94.4 FM. Okay. You're listening to Salford City Radio 94.4 FM with your host Jimmy Petruzzi on the Friday Sports Show, bringing you all the news from the local area and around the world. And we're very fortunate in this show to bring you interviews with people around the local area involved in sport, and around the world. We specialise on the show speaking to different people across the world who work in various capacities. We're very fortunate to interview people who are world-class athletes, sports people, footballers. We speak to trainers, coaches. We've also got a new segment on the show which interviews people in the field of psychology. We're very fortunate to interview some really big names, influential people in the field of psychology as well. So that's another segment on the show. But today we make our way to India, which is a really interesting interview today. We're certainly aware of the Indian cricket team, the men's cricket team, a number of stars over many years who've played the game, and obviously, well aware of the ability and the talent that comes from Indian cricket. And today we're going to sort of look at women's cricket in India, and quite an interesting insight into the game of women's cricket in India. And today's guest is the head coach of Chandigarh Cricket Association. She's got a lot of experience in cricket, and we're going to sort of hear what her journey has been like in the world of cricket, and we'll sort of get an idea what her role involves presently. So Khyati Gulani, welcome to the show. Great to have you on board.
So yeah, hi everyone. It's nice talking to you today. I'm very fortunate that I've got a chance to speak about my journey.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting to see what the journey is. And I mean, you work for Chandigarh Cricket Association at the moment, but can you tell our listeners what your journey's been like, Khyati, into the cricket world?
Yeah. So basically, it's interesting to get into cricket, and it's the way. So being a coach is the way, like how we can give back to the game and give back to the society. So yeah, it's the best way. So basically, I started playing cricket in 1995, and I played all the age groups and then Ranji Trophy, and I'm a first-class cricketer. And then somehow I stopped playing in 2006. And then I did a lot of courses in cricket coaching because I really get into coaching to serve to this beautiful game. So that's the best way to give back to this game. So I thought whatever I could not inherit from my coaches, I'll try and give and pass on that kind of a knowledge to my trainees and help them develop in their game. So I started coaching from 2007 after doing courses in coaching from BCCI, and I also did my level 2 from Cricket Australia. And I keep updating myself by doing online courses and in person also, if I can do any kind of courses which I get to know to update my knowledge. And also, I have been coaching Delhi state team for 8 to 9 years, as I'm based out of Delhi. But last year, BCCI initiated to give affiliation to northeast states. So that's how they gave me an opportunity to coach Nagaland team, and they are best known for their soccer. But then that was a challenge for us, for me being a cricketer, to teach them cricket, because their main base is soccer. Yes. So it was very beautiful because they are very athletic people, and they had hunger to learn. So it was very challenging and same time interesting also. So this year I am with the Chandigarh team, and this is also a new state which got affiliation under BCCI. So it was a very good, interesting journey this year, and we won all the 9 matches, one-day matches, and so now we are qualified for elite group. So it's an amazing journey, and I've done a lot of NCA camps also, and I also apart from coaching, I come as cricket expert on news channels, as well as I keep on doing working with schools to develop their sports curriculum, especially cricket. So that's how that's my journey.
That's a really interesting journey, and in the UK and around the world, we're familiar with the big names in men's cricket like Kohli and Dhoni and Jasprit Bumrah. We know many of the men's cricketers and the huge superstars around the world. And in terms of the women's game, Khyati, what's the women's game like in India? Is it sort of developing, and where does it sort of stand on the world stage, the women's game?
Yeah, so basically, as we all know that we were runners-up in 2017 World Cup, India. So basically, the likes of Mithali Raj, Jhulan Goswami, Smriti Mandhana, Jemima Rodriguez, and Harmanpreet Kaur. So they are the best in the world. and they're part of the squad. And recently also last year, this year in fact in February, we were the runners-up in T20 World Cup also. It's a world stage. And so India is really, you can say on number 2 or number 3, you can say in the ICC ranking. And definitely the players like Harmanpreet Kaur, Mithali Raj, and Poonam Yadav, Jemmy, and Smriti Mandhana, they are on the top on ICC ranking.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And for yourself, the journey to transition to coaching, how have you found it to be a coach? Just so the listeners sort of, give them an insight into what it's like to be a coach. Obviously, India, loves the cricket and a lot of talented players. But what's it like to be a coach, Khyati?
So basically, when we were players, so when I was a player, so definitely we only have to groom ourselves. We have to take care of our own body, our own game. We have to develop our own, things. So when we get into coaching, being a coach, we have to this transition have to be, so from us to it goes to a team. So we just have to care about what team is thinking, how we can improve their game, and how we can really pass on that knowledge. And it's like we have always heard about line that one size fits all, but in coaching it does not fit all. So because it has to be, it varies from a player to player. So we have to get into their shoes and think the way they think. And then we have to, design a program, and we have to be very patient when it comes to coaching. So this kind of a transition which I, got into my life when I, there was a transmission from, being a player to coach.
That's really interesting. You say, and obviously, when you play, you sort of focus on yourself, and then you're a coach. You need to make sure the players develop. And in terms of highlights, what would you say your highlights of being a coach have been? You've been a coach for a while now, and you've obviously worked with some great players. What would you say some of the career highlights you've had so far in coaching?
So definitely it's a different ball game altogether. So in coaching, we learn a lot of things. We have to. So that's how I feel that I have to read something or the other every day, so that we can, stand straight in front of our players.
And what inspired you to become a coach, Khyati? What was your inspiration to move into coaching for you?
Yeah. So basically, when I was a player, so I saw that there were few things which my coach could not, pass on to me. So I thought that kind of a gap should not be there, and I will try and keep updating myself, and whatever is whatever best I can offer to my players, I will do. And that's how I thought that there was some gap between me and my coach. So that's why I could not convert into an Indian player. So that's why I wanted to fill that gap and wanted to give that kind of a platform to my trainees. So that's how I wanted to become a coach.
Yeah, and so you sort of felt as a player there were certain areas that you could help the players develop. And has it changed the game since you've been coaching, since you sort of started coaching, and now what are some of the differences you think from when you first started coaching and now? Is there any changes in the game, do you think, or is it pretty much like it was when you first started?
No, definitely there are changes because of technology and the kind of equipment now it's there. So it's like earlier it was we used to go to the open ground and used to play, but now we have equipment and we know that's how we can, no one used to recognize women's cricket, so there was no pressure because people never knew Indian women's team is also exist. But now since 2017 World Cup, perceptions have been changed. So now they have a lot of followers in terms of TV and all followers. So now they look for the results, definitely, because they are watching the game. So they want. So followers always want the players to win all the matches. So that kind of pressure is there, definitely, from the followers. But when it comes to BCCI, because they know the system and they know we cannot win all the matches, so they support their players. But your followers on they troll their players if they're doing good, and if they're winning the match today, they will make you God in India. But if you're not winning, definitely they'll burn your houses and all that stuff. So that kind of thing has not yet come in women's cricket, but yes, they put pressure on women players as well.
Yeah. And where do you sort of see the future of women's cricket in India? Where do you sort of see cricket going from now? Obviously, the success of the World Cup, they did the really good tournament. Where do you see it going from now, Khyati, women's cricket?
So basically, yes. I mean, earlier we used to, look for the good, prospects in women's cricket, good, players. But now players are coming up. So I feel that in the coming years, definitely there will be more and more of job opportunities for women cricketers. Not only railways or one or two more places, but I'm looking forward to see women commentators, more of women commentators in men's cricket as well, and more of job opportunities, career opportunities, so that they can take it as a standalone event. So definitely that thing, and of course IPL as a standalone event for women's.
And how have you found it working in the media in India for cricket, Khyati? How do you find the work that you do in the media in Indian cricket?
So yeah, I mean, definitely it's an interesting thing, but still we are lacking in that place, because there are only when it comes to Indian Women's World Cup or something, they give opportunities to women commentators, but we still, it's the thing is lacking when like men's game is going on and they invite some women commentators. So we are looking forward for that thing, so that they can invite us for Ranji men's matches or international matches as women cricketers to be a part of that panel.
And your thoughts on the men's game in India? I mean, sort of from a professional point of view, do you sort of? I mean, at the moment, obviously, there's a lot of stars. Do you see the production line of stars keep continuing? And how do you see the men's game in the future in India?
So men's game, of course, they have a very bright future. They still have a bright future, and it's like in coming years, I'm sure that there'll be one more event like IPL, and because there are more, or maybe they'll increase the number of teams as they're discussing, like from 8 to 10 or 12 in IPL, and more of job opportunities. And then at Ranji Trophy level, they're planning to double their match fee, so that players don't have to do work anywhere else other than practicing cricket. So that's what I'm seeing.
And is it full time for the women's game in India? Do they work as well, or do they do cricket? Just are they professional, the women's cricket in India?
No, as of now, they just get a very small kind of a match fee, and which does not suffice all. So they have to work along with it. So they work for railways, which is only one company who is offering the jobs, which is not full proper. So it's like they have to work apart from that. So that's what we are looking for. Like if some women is playing cricket, so it should be like they should concentrate on that. So they should get that amount of money so that they can feed their family.
Absolutely, and it makes the achievement in the World Cup even more remarkable that that they can sort of obviously work and play cricket and sort of go as far as that as well. And in terms of your own role at Chandigarh, where do you sort of see that going now? I mean, what are your aspirations there and going forward?
So yeah, basically there were many women cricketers who played cricket for India from Chandigarh. So, but they used to play for Punjab that time. Now they have got affiliation. So definitely, I'm looking for one or two more players by next year or so from Chandigarh to represent India. And there is a lot of talent in Chandigarh, as they are very strong. They are very athletic. And they have that kind of hunger, and they were waiting from last 10 to 15 years to get that affiliation. So now they've got the opportunities and facilities. I'm sure that there'll be more of Indian players coming out of that place.
No, that's really interesting stuff. And you mentioned the facilities there. I mean, how do you sort of how are the facilities like in terms of training facilities? Are they sort of, do you have all the facilities that you need to develop players, or what are the facilities like in general?
So yeah, they have grounds, but it's not that it's properly inherent to them. So it's like they rent out those grounds from schools and all. but they are very well maintained, and they're planning to have 2-3 grounds in future by 2 or 3 years, and I'm sure that they'll be having good big grounds, because Chandigarh is a very beautiful city, and by weather-wise also, it's a really interesting place to be. So, and there is no pollution, there is no traffic jams, nothing. So it's the best place to play cricket after Dharamshala. So I'm sure that in the coming years they will be having a very good place to play cricket.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I mean, on this show we have many sort of young sports people who listen to the show, and many people sort of maybe their sort of thoughts on cricket. In terms of from a coach point of view, what would you say, Khyati, to maybe say a young girl who's sort of considering playing cricket but they're not quite sure? What are some things that you could sort of suggest in terms of any sort of young person thinking, well, I'd like to play cricket but I'm not sure about it?
Sure. So the thing is, when I started playing cricket, when Mithali started, so that time there were no, we never thought of like we will get something in return. But now the players who have come out, they see that money is coming on their way when they play cricket. So that time we never thought of quitting, because we thought that why we started. So the same thing I'll tell the young girls who plans to start cricket. So just whenever the thought comes in your mind that you want to quit, just think once that why you started. So then everything will be sorted.
That's really interesting. And I mean, people like yourself, like some of the pioneers of the women's game, you sort of, you sort of played. You're really passionate about the game, and you love for the game. Have you sort of seen cricket change from the financial point of view? Sort of with money coming into the game, do you think that the motivation is different now, or you said to connect back to that, why you started playing the game? I mean, obviously money is important. People need to sort of be able to focus on the game, but do you sort of see changes in view of that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when we used to play under WCI, World Cricket Association of India, so that time there was no money. We used to book tickets from our own pockets, and there was no craze. Yeah, so but that time still the passion was alive. And now also passion is same, but then yes, definitely the girls who are coming up, so they look for money. Definitely money is important, but that time also money was important, but we were so passionate about the game that we never thought that we have any expectations from in terms of money. But still, things have changed when it comes under when it got merged with BCCI in 2006. So that time money came, so we got facilities like traveling in the plane in the first class, and staying in 3 or 4 star hotels, and getting match fees and getting contracts. So definitely things have changed, and now women players are taking up cricket as a career option, which is good.
No, that's really interesting. And I think the thing is, like, if you can play sort of full time, it makes a big difference in terms of sort of practicing, and it gives you the extra edge. And what would it mean if they could play full time and just purely concentrate on just cricket, and not have to sort of do another job, just focus on cricket? From a coaching point of view, would that be a big help to develop players?
Definitely. I mean, nowadays, like there is a lot of other distractions are there. So seeing that, we feel that if they just have to concentrate on cricket, and if whatever the distractions is there, like technology, like media, so it will be still there. And apart from them, that if they have to think about their livelihood, then it becomes a little difficult to make them alive in the cricket. So definitely, if that part is taken care of, livelihood, definitely we'll get much more better results on a international platform.
That's interesting. And who would you say at the moment in women's cricket, which sort of who are sort of India's biggest rivals in the women's game at the moment from a national point of view?
England is the team which unfortunately they cannot get that game, semi-final game, because of the rains. But I think that if that match would have happened, that would have a very tough match against England. And I feel that they have a very good team, and altogether 15 players, I would say that they are very good. And I was very lucky to come to UK twice, last year and last year, and I saw those players that they're very committed, very disciplined, very athletic, and they're very skillful. and that's the fear that India team have.
That's interesting, and in terms of the game itself at Chandigarh, your development role, what does it generally involve? Your role for Chandigarh, being the head coach, is it develop players? I mean, what's what does your role involve, Khyati, at Chandigarh?
Yeah. So basically, I'm heading the cricket part. So definitely, we have a team of physio, trainer, and a manager, and I'm the head coach. So I, give them work so that we work. We work together in sync, so that we can have a better results at the end of the year. So I look for I always take care of the skill part of it. And then whatever we plan a program, so we sit together and then we plan a program so that we can, develop a player's game.
That's interesting. And your role at Delhi, you still work at Delhi as well, too, or you still working for the Delhi women's cricket team as well?
No, so we are allowed to, work for one state. So at the moment, I'm working for Chandigarh. Yeah. So it's just that the past players who knows me well and who have worked under me. So at times they come to me and they look for help for me. So I always help them. Yeah. So
you're happy to. It's okay to give them sort of some. Obviously, you've got a lot of experience, and they look up to you as a coach to sort of.
Yes.
Yeah. And sort of in terms of, is it more like a technical thing, or just sometimes when you develop players, they sort of just want someone to talk to when things are challenging, or is it a bit of both?
So basically, as we all know that skills are just 20%, but 80% is mental strength. Yeah. So I always ask them to work on their mental strength and focus and the things like visualization and all. So if they have a skill and if they are not able to execute it because of their mental, trauma or something, whatever. So weakness or something. So there is no point of having a skillful player. So it's best to have to work on your mental toughness, so that if even you are not very skillful, but you are able to execute whatever till date.
No, that's interesting, and that's a good point. The psychology of the game is really important, and certainly in cricket where it's a team sport, but you have your individual role as well. Whether you're batting or bowling or fielding, you've got to be really switched on. But it's been really fascinating speaking to you. I want to thank you for your time. No doubt our listeners have really enjoyed an insight into women's cricket in India. So I really want to thank you for coming on board the show. Khyati, it's great stuff to hear from you, and we wish you all the success in the future at Chandigarh, and we'll sort of definitely keep an eye out to see how you guys get on. So thank you for coming on board the show.
Thanks for having me, Jimmy.
Great
Thanks
stuff.
a lot.
Thank you. That was Khyati Gulani, head coach of Chandigarh Cricket Association. Really interesting insight into women's cricket in India. Speaking to Salford City Radio 94.4 FM, the Friday Sports Show. If you host Jimmy Petruzzi, feel free to drop us an email on our Facebook page. If you've got any questions, comments about today's show, what an interesting insight we've had into the women's game of cricket in India. Great show, and thank you for joining us.